efficient in the world. We all know the firm. Now we're going to hear from the man, Jeremy Allaire, founder of Circle. Jeremy, please. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Hello. So, welcome. Thanks for doing this. And hello, everyone. So, how are things going at Circle? Let's start off with that.
Good. We have a lot going on. We acquired an exchange last year. We launched one of the fastest growing regulated stablecoin, the US dollar coin, last year. We launched a new retail investment product, Circle Invest. We recently acquired the leading equity crowdfunding platform in the US, Seed Invest, which is a leading fundraising platform, and we're working on introducing tokenization into that platform. And we've been busy.
Excellent. So could you talk a little bit, I know you've made some statements on this, but just your views on US regulation regarding crypto, kind of what you see as the landscape, what you see as any issues that they really need to address?
Yeah, I mean, we've been pretty outspoken about this. We've talked a lot about it in different forms, but effectively, starting in 2017, when ICOs were starting to happen, the SEC sort of kind of stepped in and said that they felt that most of these things were very likely securities, or should be treated as securities. And I think over the course of 2018, there was some of that reiterated, but also there was an enormous amount of kind of gray area. Like, there were sort of interpretations, what crypto assets might be considered like commodities. There's this idea that you had utility tokens, commodity tokens, digital currencies, as opposed to things that really were securities. And then in April of this year, the guidance, an updated set of guidance came out, and it really went the wrong direction in our view. It basically expanded the scope of definitions so that virtually every crypto asset, even arguably something like Bitcoin, might be considered a security in the U.S. And that is widely perceived to be a really negative thing for the U.S. For crypto asset innovation. The regulation of things like exchanges of digital currency, exchanges for Bitcoin, that's actually been in place since 2013 in the U.S. Actually one of the most advanced countries in the world. But this broader innovation of tokenization, new crypto assets, new cryptocurrency projects, that's really been curtailed. A lot of companies leaving the U.S., setting up internationally. Circle's done some of that ourselves. And projects, leading blockchain projects, having to really domicile themselves outside the U.S. And so, obviously Asia continues to lead in this market. And I think in many areas, the U.S. is very much falling behind.
Okay. So can you talk a little bit about, since you mentioned Asia and that is the topic of this, where you see Asia doing the right thing, what you see as kind of the promising areas here?
Yeah, I mean, I think Singapore is a great example of it, which is essentially having some baseline of rules around things like ICOs, but really allowing the free market to flourish. I think you've just seen this tremendous growth in exchange activity, tremendous growth in digital asset projects, blockchain projects, token offerings. We saw the numbers from CoinGecko earlier. The story's pretty clear. This is a much more open, free market view of this, allowing projects to happen and flourish, and that's driving the majority of the innovation really coming out of Asia right now.
Yeah, so what do you think about the moves the PBOC has made with the digital currency there?
Yeah, so I mean, we've been interested in the ability to use, say, central bank money in a digital currency form since we founded Circle in 2013. In fact, a big part of the vision behind the company was the belief that public blockchains would eventually allow us to take traditional fiat currency and build cryptocurrency versions of that. And that cryptocurrency versions of fiat currencies could effectively work over the internet the same way that we exchange data, exchange content, and other things. And that as that happened, that could lead to dramatically more economic integration than we've seen before, in the same ways that we have deeper kind of communications integration because of the internet. So I think we started to see significant work and thinking out of the People's Bank of China starting in 2014. They kicked off R&D and a focus in this area, and you have to put it in context. I think the rise of China in the world economy is also correlated to, I think, the rising ambition for the Chinese yuan to be a major reserve currency in the world. And I think there's concerns not just from China, but concerns all around the world around dollarization in the global economy. And so ultimately, a Chinese RMB that can be a digital currency offers an incredible opportunity for China to project its currency on a global basis without really being dependent on the traditional Western banking system. And so it's really, from my perspective, a major leap forward in terms of how money works. It's been obvious for 6 years that the future of money was cryptocurrency, both the sort of sovereign and non-sovereign types of cryptocurrency. That's just accelerating. It's going to accelerate for Bitcoin and similar, but it's also going to accelerate for these central bank digital currency models. That's also why you've seen growth, I think, in things like US dollar coin, Tether, and other US dollar pegged stablecoins as well.
Okay, so with the fiat digital currencies, you see a world that is much more, it is less dollar based, I guess? Or?
Well, I think we're interested in a world where anyone, anywhere can exchange value with any other person instantly at no cost, with a high degree of security, with no counterparty risk. And that's the promise of cryptocurrency. People want to be able to do that with price stable currencies. They want to be able to do that with the currency that maybe they receive their salary in or they pay for goods and services with. And so our belief is that in the coming years, there'll be mass proliferation in these reserve currency digital currencies, in US dollar digital currency tokens, in Eurozone, in yen, in other major reserve currencies. The Chinese RMB is certainly an example of that. And I think it raises just new questions, which is, if I'm a sovereign, it's interesting and potentially very compelling to have my currency work anywhere that the internet works. And it's interesting potentially for holders of those and users of those. I think that that's just going to raise policy questions that have just never been contemplated before. The bigger, I think, idea, which we've been an advocate of, and clearly now with Libra is there's going to be a major step towards it, is can we effectively take on a trade-weighted basis or some basis, the leading reserve currencies of the world and build a basket token that can be a global unit of account that people all around the world would value as what they'd like to use in everyday payments, and really as part of a deeper economic integration in the world. I think that's inevitably where we're going to reach. And it's not just necessarily the fiat currencies that are part of that. I think Bitcoin's going to play a big part of that too. Okay.
What do you think about Libra, about the approach to it, what they've selected as their basket, those things?
Well, I think it's an incredibly ambitious project. I think we and a lot of other people in the industry are very excited about it. When we founded Circle in early 2013, we very much had a belief that we would reach a world in the next 5 to 10 years, back then, 5 to 10 years, where there would be these global digital currency units that would be based on things like the SDR, which is the IMF's originally proposed basket global currency unit. And so to see a technology company with 2 billion users proposing these things is really, really exciting. And so just generally very, very excited. The details of it in terms of what's been published in the white paper are interesting. It obviously is, it's ambitious in many respects, but it's also very conservative in other respects. I think there's a huge difference between, say, a government-administered digital currency or a sort of public-private type of administered digital currency, such as what we're seeing from the People's Bank of China, versus a kind of permissioned consortium, private infrastructure, global digital currency, which is sort of what we're seeing with Libra, and public chains. And I think the real disruption here is that we have a new global public infrastructure, public blockchains, that is fully decentralized, that any person in the world can connect to and interact with, and that you can build more and more layers of value on top of. That's really the disruption, and I think that's ultimately what is most valuable to the world. Facebook and the Libra Association have sort of made, I think, statements that eventually they'd like to be more decentralized, but starting in a much more centralized way. We'll sort of see how that goes, but I think there's going to continue to be enormous demand, both from individuals and developers and broader kind of the broader crypto ecosystem for these public blockchains and the associated crypto assets. So I think they're still going to play a major role, and we'll see actually ultimately whether or not public chain or crypto assets like Bitcoin, maybe that even plays a role in Libra's future as well.
Yeah. What do you see as the likely effectiveness of Libra in, for instance, helping the unbanked? I know there are some concerns about sort of the distribution mechanism of how you convert cash into anything digital and that sort of thing. Do you see that as effective, or what do you think is the biggest hope for unbanked people generally?
Yeah, I mean, I think ultimately, whether it's Bitcoin or US dollar coin or Libra or any other cryptocurrency, it's sort of how available and accessible are the on and off ramps all around the world is ultimately sort of what will determine in the short term, at least short to mid-term, the kind of utility for everyday people, right? If there are seamless on and off ramps from, say, physical cash into a cryptocurrency, or to move from electronic banking into cryptocurrency and to do that in a seamless way, if you have those on and off ramps, and especially if you have those on and off ramps into these price stable, like stable coins, then value can be kind of kept in the stable coins, and it can be used more and more for more everyday transactions. And so I think in, say, unbanked markets, really the key is going to be how seamless is it, how fast, how easy, how frictionless is it for people to get from, say, physical cash, which is a more common use of currency for the unbanked, into these cryptocurrencies. And that's really going to be what decides and determines how broadly these can be used for everyday people.
Okay, and you've mentioned the US dollar stable coins. Are you seeing demand for that? Can you talk a little bit more about that within Asia?
Yeah, maybe to step back, I think I'll talk a little bit about sort of how we think about it and our approach, and then we can talk about how that obviously functions in Asia and globally. So, our interest has always been in how can we establish new standards in the same way that we have technical standards for the exchange of content and data on the internet today. So we can all use HTTP to exchange information globally. Anyone can put up a server and put content on it, and any device anywhere in the world can connect to that and access that content. Those interoperable standards are what create the global network effects that make the internet so useful to us. The same thing with like SMS or internet email standards, video over IP, all these kind of standards that exist. So it's been very clear to us that for fiat digital currency, we need to have common standards that people can implement that work consistently. And so when we started work on something called Center, which I'll talk more about, that was really the goal. The goal was, how do we build an open standard that's an open source technology that anyone can implement, and then build a kind of governance framework around how do you evolve the technology and how do people interact with it more broadly. And we co-founded that with Coinbase last year. It's called the Center consortium. And there's a set of protocols that are stablecoin protocols at the center, no pun intended, of Center. And the first implementation of those stablecoin protocols is US dollar coin. We wanted to start with the US dollar because it played such a central role in the global crypto markets. The global crypto markets are predominantly denominated in dollars, and the initial use case for US dollar coin was really trading in the crypto capital markets. Ultimately, the use of stablecoins is going to be for every form of financial asset, every type of financial transaction. Today, it's sort of bootstrapped in the crypto capital markets. But we wanted it to be a standard where there could be many different issuers of this and where there was real transparency. There are other stablecoins, obviously. The first and most prominently known is USDT or Tether, which has really suffered from lack of transparency, no one really knowing like what's behind it, is it even there? That's created issues. Lack of compliance. Ultimately, are there regulated financial institutions that sit in front of and can be issuing and redeeming these? And then like actual liquidity in the real world banking system. That's really key. So we wanted to build a model which was transparent, that was audited by a global auditing firm, that was open source, and that could be really adopted. And that launched little less than a year ago, and it's grown very, very fast. So US dollar coin, We've seen over $1 billion of US dollars tokenized and issued as USDC. I think there's over 20 billion traded in crypto markets, about 17 billion of US dollar coin transactions on chain. So a huge amount of growth there. And it's just at the start. Tether is about 5 years old. US dollar coin is less than a year old. I think transparent, issued by regulated firms with a standard model is going to be really attractive. And then ultimately that gets to the use cases, which is we see stablecoins starting in the crypto markets, but eventually just used for every form of payment interaction, using them in financial contracts, debt contracts, equity-like contracts. Any financial contract that can be written in code and put on a blockchain is going to use stablecoins within it as well.
Okay, so speaking of Tether, they recently reportedly launched this yuan stablecoin. What do you think about that, and would Circle ever do something similar?
So Center, so Circle and Coinbase are both co-founding members of Center. Center's now open to other firms who are applying to also be issued, but Center has a published roadmap, and the published roadmap includes launching additional reserve currency tokens. So adding other major reserve currency tokens is something that you should expect to see out of Center. And then launching a multi-chain architecture so that the stablecoins can be swappable and usable across multiple chains. We don't believe in a sort of one blockchain that rules them all. We believe that there are going to be multiple chains, there'll be special purpose chains, and there'll be some generalized kind of computing chains like Ethereum and platforms that are competing with it. So multi-chain, multi-currency, so yes, you should expect to see more. And then over the long run, we'd like to also introduce a basket currency as well that's based on those reserve currency tokens, but ultimately include Bitcoin in that basket as well. We think that the mix of digital currencies that will make up the global currency units of the future will include both sovereign and non-sovereign digital currencies.
Okay, so would it be just Bitcoin probably, or maybe a mix of things? Or?
I mean, right now, Bitcoin really does dominate as the principal non-sovereign form of digital money. And so, you sort of look at market cap, you look at kind of utility, liquidity, depth, global reach. And while Bitcoin right now has a very small market capitalization in the hundreds of billions of dollars, we expect over the coming years it to be multiple trillions of dollars. And when you compare that to other reserve currencies, I mean, it should get to the scale of kind of reserve currency market capitalization, and that will make more sense as a piece of a basket of a global currency.
Okay. And as Bobby Yang was saying, there's a lot of competition in Asia who's showing us all that. Do you think Circle's well placed to succeed in that, and what are your advantages?
Well, there's different pieces for us. I think just talking about stablecoins, because that's so important. We think that stablecoins are extremely popular in Asia. There are a lot of markets in Asia that want a dollar asset, want to be able to move value in and out of a dollar asset, whether it's as a sort of offshore mechanism or for transacting or settlements or trading or other things. And so we think we already see with US dollar coin, while the vast majority of the trading with it is on Asian exchanges. There are our own exchange, Coinbase's exchange, also are significant markets too, but Asia really is significant there, and we have some major focuses in terms of business development, market makers, exchange platforms, distributors, others that are going to be doing more with it as well.
Okay. So just taking a step back from overall in the space, what crypto trend or innovation do you see as the most exciting or the most compelling right now?
I think obviously the whole promise of all this that got us into it in the first place was this idea of programmable money. First and foremost, that you would have cryptocurrencies that could be exchanged and used by anyone, anywhere, and that essentially payments as a business model, as a customer, as a user, would just become a free service on the internet, the same way that email and content sharing and data sharing are just free services on the internet. And so now with the rise of stablecoins, things like Libra on the horizon, I think that's going to happen. We're going to see that. But that's just sort of like the base layer. Once you have the free exchange of money for everyone everywhere, the fact that you can program that money, that you can write code that represents economic relationships between people and businesses, that allows you to represent whether it's a labor relationship or a commercial relationship or an investment relationship. When you can start to actually transform both the commerce layer and the finance layer into code and do that on a public global infrastructure that everyone can access, that's the most exciting thing. So very specifically, what is that today? That's sort of what people call decentralized finance or DeFi, and that's basically all happening on Ethereum today. That's where a lot of the innovation is, where people are basically building open, smart contracts that are running on decentralized infrastructure. They're not controlled by any company, but they create, for example, lending markets. They create debt markets. They're creating interest rate markets. They're creating all kinds of new financial markets on a decentralized infrastructure that's permissionless, that anyone can interact with. When you combine stablecoins with that, you're creating kind of the nucleus of a new kind of global capital market. And when you start to see more and more stablecoins for more and more currencies being able to interact with that, you'll start to see decentralized infrastructure for FX markets, and all of these things starting to come into place. That's really exciting. That's like the birth of a new global financial system. I think that's why a lot of entrepreneurs are getting into the space, and why people are so excited about crypto finance is that we can start to build these things. So that's, I think, the most exciting thing right now.
Okay, and just I'm interested in what you're looking at within Asia. What countries are doing interesting regulatory things that you think are positive, and what countries might need to work on their regulatory regimes?
Yeah, I mean, I'm not an expert on the Asia regulatory environment. I think, obviously, we're very much advocates for kind of smart, pragmatic, relatively low-touch regulation. There's obviously major issues like fraud. Can people who issue tokens, like, are they really companies? Are they legitimate people? Are they criminals? The kinds of things like background checks, other things that are needed. I think there's important things around money laundering, financial crimes. There's international rules around that, and those should just be applied everywhere. So that's important. But I think at the same time, there's so much technical innovation happening that what you don't want to do is sort of take all the existing banking law, all the existing securities and commodities law, and just drop those down on crypto, because you'll kind of throw the baby out with the bathwater, as they say, and I think that would be really a problem. So I think jurisdictions like Singapore have been very, very smart to both embrace some form of regulatory around this, pretty light touch, make sure that projects that are launching are legitimate, real companies, but also allow the kind of crypto capital markets to flourish. I think we'd like to see that in more markets as well. I think, on the other hand, you have a market like Japan, where they've had regulations in place. You could argue that's been good in that it's sort of created some safety and soundness for the firms that operate there. Although even regulated firms suffered some of the largest and most historic hacks in the history of crypto exchanges, even in recent years. And I think the number of projects that can actually be launched out of Japan or active and traded in Japan is pretty limited. There's no rules around stablecoins. We haven't seen yen stablecoins yet, so probably a bit on the more conservative side there. And then obviously China is sort of its own beast, so to speak.
Right. So then back to the U.S. on regulation. So if you had a magic wand, what would you do with the regulatory regime in the U.S.?
Yeah, I mean, I testified to the Senate Banking Committee recently on this, and our view is that in the United States, we need a national crypto policy that establishes the rules for a national license for crypto finance companies. That should span all of the different types of key activity, whether it's kind of payments banking, exchange and brokerage type activity, as well as supporting the launch of tokenized assets. But it should be a fairly lightweight set of regulations that really deals with the most important risks, like enterprise risk, cybersecurity risk, financial crime risk, custody risk, which is a major issue, but allow a far broader range of projects to be able to launch in the U.S. and be tradable as crypto assets as well. And that should really ultimately be done by a sort of single national regulator, as opposed to the patchwork of regulations that span across states and multiple federal regulators right now.
Mm-hmm. So do you see anything different depending on the outcome of the 2020 presidential election, or this is kind of both parties are the same with it?
I think it's going to be really interesting. I mean, I think there's an opportunity for a presidential candidate to embrace crypto, and by that, it doesn't mean like that they are all of a sudden all like long holders of Bitcoin, although that would be pretty interesting. I think it's much more that the discussion right now. There's a lot of discussion about China and the U.S. That's a major topic. I think what's notable is that China is so far ahead of the U.S. right now in digital currency innovation. There's just nobody in the U.S. government working on this right now. China's years ahead, and they're building an infrastructure which is going to lead to more globalization of the Chinese yuan that will expand into trade and commerce and payments for more and more people around the world who interact with China. I think the U.S. is behind the 8 ball, and so I think a presidential candidate needs to kind of get ahead of that and realize that not only does the U.S. dollar need to be, operate in a digital currency form, and they need to create a permissible way for technology companies to do that and compete with that, such as what companies like Facebook and Circle and Coinbase are doing, but more broadly, but also embrace this infrastructure idea that public blockchains are going to be the foundation for how economic activity is built in the future. And I think a forward-looking vision would be very compelling, and I think that's a huge opportunity for presidential candidates.
Okay. So just back to Circle, I believe you did some money raising earlier in the year. So how's that going? Is it easier this year than last year, harder?
Yeah, I mean, we don't really talk about our private financing, stuff like that.
Okay. Any plans for an IPO?
No plans for an IPO.
Okay. So I guess just back to the the politics of it. I think so you think there is a place for U.S. candidates to kind of get on board with this, but do you think that anybody is particularly smart about it right now out of the people you've seen?
I mean, there's lots of different candidates in the Democratic field. I think be very interesting when you look at like the origins of Bitcoin, and you think about it as a reaction to the financial crisis and the idea that the banking system has failed us in a lot of ways, that it has not served people broadly, that there is this global underbanked and unbanked, that there's a model which is puts people in more control of their money. Like, these are really inspirational ideas behind Bitcoin, and everyone knows the history there. I think it's really interesting when you look at Senator Elizabeth Warren. She also reacted very much to the financial crisis. She became the kind of most notable person to say, look, we've got a corrupt system in banking. We've got banking companies that are taking value out of everyday American people's pockets. We have a system that's inefficient. And I think she actually has, in some ways, empathy or a belief in many of the ideals that sit behind cryptocurrency. But at the end of the day, I think connecting the dots between sort of these ideas of creating a more open, global, connected, and just financial system, and ultimately, like, what does policy need to look like? I don't see anyone who's really figured that out yet, but we'll see.
Okay, and just going back to Asia, since it's the topic and we're here, so what do you think is the best thing about Asia for crypto right now? What do you see as really the thing where it's supreme, or where there's the most potential?
Yeah, I mean, I think within crypto, obviously, just the openness of the markets, the ability for so many different projects to be able to launch and create liquidity and be tradable, the innovation in the tradable assets themselves. Like, there's been so much innovation in different types of leverage products, different types of futures products. And just like as the market infrastructure of crypto is just so far ahead and leading out of Asia right now. Interestingly, though, like the technology development of crypto, the development of the evolution of Bitcoin, the next generations of Ethereum, those tend to be much more globally distributed. There's a lot of really significant, brilliant computer science and innovation happening in the United States. So I would say, in terms of intellectual property generation, Europe is massive in crypto, the US is massive in crypto, and Asia is also quite significant. So at the kind of technology level, it's much more evenly distributed. At the market infrastructure level, clearly almost all the innovation's happening out of Asia.
Okay, great. And I think we're out of time. So thank you very much, Jeremy.
Thank you.
Great.